The drinks, hospitality and leisure sector is one of the biggest employers in the UK and a key driver of the economy. As a top 50 commercial law firm, we offer clients the advantage of a dedicated team of specialist lawyers that work solely for the operators of pubs, bars, restaurants and hotels, and drinks and leisure businesses. Our more than 35 years experience helps you get on with business. Our pragmatic solutions get to the heart of any legal matter quickly. We understand the commercial pressures you face, such as securing the right site, opening on time, and having every aspect buttoned down. As leading industry experts, we have a roster of clients that reads like an industry who's who, many of whom have been referred to us by long-standing clients and contacts. And as you well know, when it comes to the drinks, hospitality and leisure sector, you just can't beat the power of word of mouth. So do please get in touch. Freeths, serving up legal advice to the drinks, hospitality and leisure sector.
Welcome everybody to the Freeths Sector Showcase for the drinks, hospitality and leisure sector. My name is Leo Skinner and I head up the drinks, hospitality and leisure specialism for Freeths nationally. We are a rarity in that we do have an industry focused department. That's how we're arranged, and we only have sector operators as clients. I'm joined by my colleagues, Charlotte Rees-John, who is a leading employment lawyer advising operators in the sector, and also by AdamBoyd, who has spent most of his time in the pandemic era advising tenant operator clients in the sector on all matters relating to payment or, more often than not, non-payment of rent. We are fortunate to be joined by someone who really doesn't need an introduction. Kate Nicholls, Chief Executive of UKHospitality. Kate has been immersed as a spokesperson for the industry for many years, but particularly has taken a high-profile lead in taking the sector's case to government on all issues faced by operators during the pandemic. We have around 45 minutes, maybe up to an hour if discussions go free-flowing, hopefully. And we're going to start off with three areas that we've chosen to prioritise, but I'm sure there'll be more scope to cover other areas. They are industry staffing crisis, levelling up white paper issued by the government, and the end of the moratorium on forfeiture for non-payment of rent, which is fast looming. So I'm going to hand over to my colleague Charlotte to kick off with the industry staffing crisis.
Hi, thanks Leo. Hello everyone. It's staffing crisis, not just this sector. Obviously, I should say that there is a staffing crisis across many sectors, but I think we are feeling it more keenly perhaps than others for a whole host of reasons. But what I'm really interested in talking about today and having a conversation with Kate about is what we can do to make ourselves more attractive as a sector. And there's so many challenges, but one of the areas that perhaps fairly or unfairly we sometimes are seen as lagging behind in is in relation to our ESG strategy. So I wondered, Kate, if you could tell me a bit more about your feelings around that and whether you'd agree, disagree, or what more we think we could be doing.
Well, thank you very much, Charlotte, and thank you for having me here today to join you and talk about various issues with Freeths and clients. I mean, I think we undoubtedly have a staffing challenge. It came about and it came back to us much more quickly than we were anticipating having it. We had labour shortages in the sector pre-COVID. We had a vacancy rate of about 5%. We knew post-COVID that we were likely to go back to a staffing crisis because there have been shortages and well-publicised shortages across chefs for many number of years that we need to be able to tackle. I think nobody expected the staffing crisis to hit immediately upon reopening last summer. We were faced into staff absences due to COVID. We had 1 in 5 staff not coming back from furlough. We had the pingdemic, which meant you had absences exacerbating vacancies. all of those things meant we had a vacancy rate since August last year of around 10% in the sector. And as you say, it's not unique to hospitality. It also hit our supply chain. So we had a sort of double whammy. So the vacancy rates across the supply chain from farm to fork, you're looking at around 8 to 10% over the course of the summer. And that meant that you had shortages at each point in the supply chain. You had breakages in each point in the supply chain, and the hospitality operators at the bottom unable to meet demand because of all those staffing crises. And the common denominator for all of the challenges across the supply chain and the reason for so much inflation in the supply chain is staff. And I think you touched on it at the, if you look at a macro level, 1.2 million vacancies across the economy, about 500,000 people who've, since the COVID pandemic, have deliberately stepped out of employment. So these are people in the age range 16 to 64, not in education, employment or other measures, not on the claimant count, and are deliberately economically inactive. And I think that's the big issue that we haven't really grappled collectively, that you've got a much smaller labour force across the economy as a whole. I think what means...
Sorry to interrupt you, Kate. So I suppose we ought to mention the Brexit work. Has that had an impact in your opinion?
Well, I think these are much more COVID issues, if I'm brutally honest. Brexit makes it harder to remedy and deal with the situation afterwards. But these are primarily COVID issues, and these are global issues. And if I speak to my opposite numbers in America, Germany, Greece, Spain, they've all got the same issues. People have not come back to work. You've got a smaller economically active population. The only difference is that you've got greater movement within Europe, within North and South America, when the global economy pops back up. You can't press Control-Alt-Delete on the global economy and expect the supply chain to restart without problems. And that's what we're grappling with. So in my perspective, I think these are COVID issues. Brexit makes it harder to solve. Immigration is and it's probably something we can touch on later. The immigration system is complicated. For most of our businesses in hospitality, they've never had to deal with immigration. So they are starting from scratch to go through quite a complex route, and they probably need some legal handholding to help, but that's costly. But to get back to Charlotte's question about ESG, I think what it does mean is that we haven't had to work as hard to get the staff in and to recruit them into hospitality and make the case for hospitality being an employer of choice. We've talked about it a lot, but while you had higher levels of unemployment and a flexible labour market where people could move around, and as I say, Leo, it's not just immigration, it's travel restrictions due to COVID that have meant people can't move globally. We're not getting Australians coming in, we're not getting South Africans coming in. So we are going to have to work much harder. And I think the challenge for us for ESG, as in so many of these things, hospitality is a business made up primarily of small and medium enterprises. So if you want to look at ESG across retail, you go to the big four retailers, perhaps the big six. They collectively have policies, and that stands for the whole of retail. The fact that people underneath might not follow it or is beside the point. If you are an employee looking to go into retail, you look to those big companies, it sets the tone for the whole sector. We haven't been as fortunate as that in hospitality, and so I think there's much more we need to do. So yes, there's an area where we need to focus. You asked me about, is it an area where employers need to focus? I think the sector needs to focus, and I think that's the thing that UK Hospitality will be doing over the course of this year, is setting an employer brand strategy for the sector as a whole that talks about what a good place we are to work. So we've got 5 strands to that. One is about recruitment, and we are backing Hospitality Rising as a national recruitment campaign to go out in the national press to attract the broadest range of young people in the first instance, to be able to explain to them what a fun place it is to work. If Amazon is paying £20 an hour, we are never going to be able to compete with Amazon on price. We are never going to be able to compete with retail on sociable hours. Our hours are unsociable for those sort of high profile shifts, but we can do much more to make sure that we celebrate the fun side, the camaraderie, the community, which is what young people have been lacking over the last 2 years. Second, it's about having one version of the truth when it comes to careers information, going out to people to attract and working with Springboard on their Career Scope portal to make sure we've got good quality information on careers and that we show people a career as well as the job. And we're doing that work with DWP as well, so that their jobs coaches, they're the only, hospitality is the only sector they are actively promoting. Then there's around apprenticeships, there's around continuous professional development and vocational training to get people through and have in-work training. And then the final strand, the fifth strand, is employability and having an employability charter. There's some great work being done by the Hoteliers Charter. We want to make sure that that's taken across, but that's the bit that we need to start tackling now. If we're going to recruit the Gen Zs and the next generation on, they want to know what your ESG policy is. And for many smaller businesses in the sector, they don't even understand ESG. So if we can help them by templating common standards of good practice around diversity, inclusivity, carbon net zero, social and ethical trading, those things will undoubtedly help. But if I turn it back to you, what does good look like in the sector? You probably help some of the best in the sector to deal with it. How can we surface all of that good work?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just to echo everything you've said, Kate, I couldn't agree more. I think we've got to help the small and medium-sized businesses in this area. Many people, who, even those listening today, might be thinking ESG, what on earth does that stand for? So just to break that down, we've got the environmental, and you tend to get a lot of focus on the environmental, the E of ESG. So it's simple as getting rid of straws, paper cups, but having a clear strategy. For me, what good looks like, as you said, with the Gen Zs, with wanting to attract talent, this is important, not just for our customers, it's important to our customers are making choices on ESG, but also to our staffing issues and recruitment. And having a clear strategy and communicating that strategy is really important. So we might have always said, well, we've already got rid of straws and we've already done lots of good things in the E area, environmental, but have we communicated that? Have we shouted about it? And for a lot of businesses, that isn't the case. So there are some small, quite cost neutral ways in which we can demonstrate that we do care about the environment. And there's also giving time to our staff. So employees really appreciate simple initiatives. So giving time to staff to go off and concentrate on waste management. So it might be something as simple as litter picking in the local area or assisting in those kind of ways. But it's a recognition that it matters to us as an organisation. So I think there's the E of ESG. Social is obviously where I come in as an employment lawyer, talking about diversity and inclusion. We talk a lot at the moment, the buzzword is around neurodiversity, but the reality is as a sector, and for many small and medium organisations, they're still grappling with sexual harassment, some of the basics around an inclusive workforce. And so going that next step and looking at neurodiversity and attracting an inclusive workforce and a workforce that reflects our customer base can seem quite daunting, I think, can seem quite a big challenge. But actually, again, there's some really simple steps that we can take. First of all, having clear policies and communicating those, but then also looking at our recruitment techniques. So, how do we ask people to apply for jobs? Are we still, old-fashioned CVs, even they might be online, but quite text heavy? Some organisations are looking at giving people the opportunity to record a quick video. In terms of the skills that we need people who can communicate. So why are we getting them spending ages writing out a form when actually we want to see how they come across in person? So there are little steps that we can take. And then I suppose the governance, again, from a legal perspective, really important about having diversity within your leadership teams. And what I've been looking at with a number of large employers is that it's great having lots of initiatives, having your clear ESG strategy, communicating it. But if somebody says the wrong thing or doesn't get it quite right within your senior leadership team, you all of a sudden undermine all that really good work and all that potentially costly work that you put in to demonstrate that these are part of your core ethics. So it's really important that this comes from top down and that everybody at every level is really showing a commitment to ESG and has that understanding of what that means as an organisation. So I think for me, that's what good looks like. It doesn't have to be that frightening, doesn't have to cost that much money, but it's just showing that it's important to you as an organisation and showing that to the public, both your customers and also from a staff perspective.
Oh,
I think
thanks,
it's really
Sarah.
important. Sorry, go on, Leo.
I was going to say, I was actually going to move on slightly to the immigration piece, because linked to all this is, and is also linked to our next topic shortly, in terms of levelling up, what is meant by levelling up. Immigration is a, as you've alluded to, a problem, and in terms of how both you, Charlotte, and Kate envisage what the government can do to facilitate what are currently the shortages, causing quite a lot of operational problems for the clients. What do you hope for from government, Kate?
Well, this is one of those frustrating areas of government where there are some really clear red lines, and that's always difficult to find a workaround and to look at, because it seems self-evident to lots of us sitting outside and looking in at those stats of 1.2 million vacancies, record levels of vacancies, record low levels of unemployment. It's quite clear we don't have enough labour, we don't have enough bodies in the economy, in the country, to be able to do all the jobs that we want, and yet the government is maintaining quite a firm line on no changes on immigration. So that is quite challenging. There are some potentially optimistic signs coming through, though. It is being tied in with all of the trade deals. So the Australian trade deal that I talked about previously mentioned Australians coming over and not being able to travel. The Australian trade deal gives all under 35s in Australia and in the UK the right to go and work in the opposite country for up to 3 years outside of the immigration route. No skills, no qualifications, no minimum salary. It's a right to work, and the government is mirroring that approach in New Zealand. The trade deal is agreed just this week. It will also be included in the India trade deal. So you can see that outside of the very tough red lines of the immigration policy that are so difficult for so many businesses to navigate, you have got some flexibility coming through. That does mean we are going to look a little bit more like hospitality in the 1990s, where you had a large number of Commonwealth people coming over, particularly in London, working for a number of years and doing working holidays, but it will give access to a pool of labour over time. The challenge is we've got a real shortage now. We're talking to the government to see if we can streamline the bureaucracy and the cost, because actually one of the things that's come out, the difference in the 2 years pre-COVID when the immigration regime was agreed and post-COVID, salaries have increased quite dramatically. The skill level of jobs has increased quite dramatically. So what was seen as a real barrier at the start of the process, was it an NVQ level 3 job, not necessarily the person, but the job, the role being that NVQ level 3 job, and the salary around about sort of 25 to 30,000 pounds, is less of a problem now than it was originally. Still a challenge, but I wouldn't want to underestimate that. But the gaps that we're seeing are at the manager levels, are at the senior levels, as well as the lower levels. So we can navigate it, but the challenge is the cost. Particularly the immigration skills charge. So one of the things we're talking to the Home Office about is, can you go back to pre-2017. So 2017, Theresa May introduced the immigration skills charge, which is £1,000 per worker per year that you are sponsoring them through a route in order to deter immigration. Surely if we've got a points-based system that limits and restricts immigration, you don't need a double whammy of a skills charge. That's a real deterrent that we could do without. And also we could streamline the process of applying. But I don't see any quick wins or changes from the government around immigration outside of that trade route. There is a live discussion continuing with the EU 27 about a youth mobility scheme and extending the current youth mobility scheme to the EU. But again, that's not going to be a quick win. So I think that's why it's so important to start with what can we do to upskill workers in the UK and try and work within the constraints of the labour market, because the government isn't going to look at immigration changes in the next couple of years, I don't think.
Yes, and I guess it sort of rather emphasises the diversity and inclusion issue as well, isn't it, to attract people who might not have traditionally gone into the sector.
Yes.
And, you know, that's going to be an area, isn't it, where maybe a low-flying fruit to harvest in terms of potential recruits.
Yes, I think, you know, we certainly do need to do much more in that space to make sure that people understand that we are a career, not just a short-term stopgap job, and that there's a bunch of careers sitting behind the front line. So people tend to think about hospitality, they look at servers, they look at chefs, they tend to see the people who are the customer-facing people. They don't see the engineers, the marketeers, the lawyers, the digital technology people, the IT, all of those sort of skilled jobs that sit behind in head offices and in the sector as a whole. And we need to be able to articulate that. And crucially, what we need to articulate is, yes, you can start at entry level with no qualifications, doing a lower skilled job, not no skilled, but we are an ultimate meritocracy. We will take you, we will train you, and if you've got the right attitude, you can go from zero to management in under 2 years, attracting a high salary, and also we can transfer those skills across. So, you know, at no other sector will you get the responsibility devolved at such a low level within the organisation and at such a young age, and have the accelerated progression opportunities. So, you know, some of our entry-level salaries now are on a par with an entry-level solicitor, dare I say it.
Indeed. Yeah. Okay. So, well, I think we're going to move on to the next topic, levelling up, and what that means. Because to me, it means all sorts of things, and in all sorts of scenarios. Because it's whilst we've focused on perhaps what the government white paper is suggesting levelling up is going to be, although I'm still not clear, having read that, I might add. But anyway, Kate, I look forward to hearing from you on that. But there, it's levelling up in the context of all in different ways that affect operationally the businesses that we seek to represent. So I just really want to start with asking you how you see the white paper could assist the industry. And for example, obviously, no doubt there's going to be regulatory reform perhaps suggested, and indeed reform of property taxation, which we've all been long calling for. But, you know, to my mind, from the legal perspective, levelling up wouldn't it be nice, and I'm sure there'll be a few people listening who would pray for this too, that we actually had an industry acceptable form of lease. For example, that would certainly level up the situation from the legal perspective. But anyway, I digress. If we go back to what the government might help us with. So over to you, Kate, what do you think?
Well, I think this is a hugely complicated and complex area that will have many overlapping strands. And I think what you've got in the Levelling Up white paper is Michael Gove replicating his role as the spider at the centre of the web of government, because levelling up will mean many, many things and will cut across lots of different departmental policies, some of which we'll come on to touch on in terms of hospitality. But, you know, it is undoubtedly going to link in with the hospitality strategy, the tourism recovery plan, the high street recovery strategy, the, you know, sort of those big macro policy areas that the government is also looking at. We're very high on vision. We're very low at the moment on detail of what that means in practice and how it is translated through. At its essence, the Levelling Up white paper is about creating great places that people want to live, work and invest. And it is that virtuous circle. And that's how I've heard Michael Gove articulate it. It's about creating a civic and community pride in place, getting the public and the private sector services in place that mean you can deliver a great place to work, live and invest. And the sort of areas of the country that he looks to hold up as exemplars of what levelling up will mean in practice is places like Redcar, it's places like Middlesbrough, it's places around that sort of red wall seat, where you want to attract really good quality jobs, life sciences, offshore wind, technology. But on the back of that, you need to have what we would call gentrification. And that's where it dovetails with hospitality. If you're moving those civil servants from Islington and London up to Darlington, they're going to need to get a decent cappuccino in the morning, and they're going to want to have the places that they would like to go out and work. And that's where you get the investment going in that boosts the eating and drinking out and the hotels, that support the local community, gives them the areas that they want to go, gives them the access to the culture, and it all springs from that. That's not my vision. That's what Michael Gove has articulated it as. So from that, you take that nexus. They then need to get the good transport link up to Gateshead and Newcastle, because that's where the cultural hub is, and that's where you're seeing the spread of Arts Council funding outside of London and out of the region. So levelling up is about levelling up within a region as much as it is about levelling up across the country. And in a nutshell, that's it. If you then look at the rest of the levelling up white paper, it is Theresa May's industrial strategy reskinned and repurposed for a new environment that looks outside of London and outside of the sort of major metropolitan areas. I think through that, you can then flow through to how do you deliver that in practice, and what do you do to incentivise that investment, and that inward investment in particular, and relocation. And you've touched on some of it. You are going to need to see root and branch reform of business rates. So local devolution of business rates was first talked about in 2015. The white paper re-articulates that so that, development areas, local economic partnerships can get hold of the business rates revenue in their area to attract the businesses that they want and support the investment that's needed. And then in the high street reform and hospitality strategy, leasehold reform is talked about there. You've got a business rates regime that was last refreshed in 1988 when we were going around on roller skates and the newest technology was the Sony Walkman. We've now got a computer in our pocket that is more powerful than any computer at the time. Property legislation, 1940s, 1950s, it's about regenerating and rebuilding an urban environment post-war. Now, you might say that that's pretty similar to what we've got with COVID, but actually it's not fit for purpose anymore. It doesn't meet the needs of the customer, and it's not customer centric. I think there's then, flows into planning, it flows into licensing. And I think where it's really helpful to work with companies like Freeths and the clients you've got within the Freeths family is that you can tell us where the shoe pinches. You can tell us what's stopping that inward investment. Why does somebody go and invest in Darlington and doesn't invest in Dundee or Aberdeen or whatever it is? What is it that's stopping it? And then we can try and make reform. And I think the government, particularly Michael Gove, is ready to do a big COVID reset moment. We can tear up things that have been in place forever and you don't need to refresh. We can look at those again. So, tell me what you would like to see as levelling up, and I'll take it to the heart of government.
Well, here's my chance. Planning has got to be the biggest frustration of that we come across on a regular basis, and whether it's just change of use, or whether it's in terms of new developments coming through, there seems to be inconsistency across the regions as to the application of planning principles, it's a very expensive process. It's a very long process. It causes massive amounts of delays in rollouts in terms of acquisition programs, which of course are hugely generative of jobs and things like that, which is very frustrating for all concerned. I think that that is a major piece that really government could really help. In terms of licensing, I see licensing as less of an obstacle. It is quicker, it is cheaper to go through the process. If only planning were the same, that would be a joy to behold, really. But I don't know how you feel about licensing, Kate. Do you feel there are problems there still?
I think it's too early to say as to how that will come out post-COVID. Certainly, it had settled down quite a lot. And as you say, that it doesn't cause as many delays. I think there is that rub always as to where does planning and licensing overlap, and you have two sequential application process that can cause delay. So you can get something through planning and then you won't get it through licensing. So I think that is the big opportunity, and actually government is starting to look at that again. For many listeners on the call, they might recall that there was a House of Lords inquiry into the licensing Act in 2016, and that proposed closer alignment to planning and licensing and reform of the two to make it a streamlined process. And they're starting to pick that back up again now, and I think you'll see a lot of that, of something that was in train in 2016-17 now being picked up post-COVID. So I think there's opportunities there that could streamline planning. And I suppose as well there is that we've had a real life experiment. You know, COVID has delivered cafe culture in many of our town and city centres, with the deregulation of outside spaces use, deregulation of marquees and temporary structures, and pavement licensing. And I think that national pavement licensing regime has undoubtedly helped. So I'm really hopeful that local authorities will take a pragmatic approach and say, well, we've seen for 2 years that this has happened. The sky hasn't fallen down. Local residents might have had a few grumbles and niggles, but it has settled down by and large. I don't know whether you would agree that sort of temporary regime has been helpful.
Absolutely, and it's been a lifeline for the businesses. You know, it's been the way they've been able to continue, and at the same time allow them to engage in a different way with their customer base, and so yeah, hugely beneficial, and I hope it can continue in the same sort of vein. I don't see why not. As you say, the sky hasn't fallen in.
Yes.
And I think there are some councils that adopt a much more strict policy. There are some areas that have to have special treatment for various reasons, security or others, so one has to allow for that fact. But broadly speaking, I agree. Cafe culture, I hope, is here to stay. And do you feel that does Levelling Up envisage more support for the industry following the delay in recovery caused by Omicron, the pandemic, and loss of Christmas trade? I mean, we've got the immediate aftermath we're all living through now. What can the government do more to help there?
I don't think the Levelling Up white paper envisages any more support. I mean, I think business rates reform is probably as far as it goes in terms of spreading the burden, spreading the pain. But I undoubtedly think the government is going to need to do more. I think we've got some real unprecedented headwinds, and the horrific news coming out of the Ukraine. I mean, that's another shock to the global economy that is going to pile inflation on top of inflation, that is going to cause further problems in the supply chain for the sector and disrupt the recovery as we look towards the recovery. And I think the government is always optimistically hoping the recovery is going to come as government support tails off. But I think, you know, we've got huge challenges in hospitality with losing Christmas. The anticipation was that we would reopen without restrictions in June last year. We'd have an unrestricted summer of trading where we built up some cash reserves, repaired some shattered balance sheets. Christmas is 25% of profits. It's the equivalent of 3 months of normal trading. That would be the time at which you could get the sector back into recovery, have some cash in the bank. 1 in 3 hospitality businesses has no cash reserves. That's the impact of losing Christmas. And effectively, you've delayed that recovery by 3 months. But even before we'd lost Christmas, as I said at the start, we reopened with high cases. We reopened a month late. We reopened with high cases, and we had the pandemic and labour shortages and supply chain shortages. We didn't have normal trading. We didn't hit sort of peak demand. We couldn't service demand in the run up to Christmas. And then we lost Christmas. The sector now, and it probably takes us on to our next topic really quite nicely, you know, we've got a perfect storm coming at the end of this month. The support was designed to taper away after we've repaired the balance sheets at Christmas. We haven't done that. The support still tapers away. So you have business rates bills kick back in effectively in full for most of the sector, £110,000 cap on the support that a company is going to get. 2 sites and you're out. You know, that's the maximum. The rest of the time you're paying full. A large London site and you're probably maxed out as well. You've got cost price inflation currently running at about 15% in the sector, only likely to get worse. Energy bills, 50 to 100% increases, labour, 13% increases. So you've got cost price inflation pressures. You have VAT change, you've got NICs, you've got national living wage, all coming at exactly the same time. And businesses at the moment are trading under the protection of the rent moratorium, and also sitting alongside it, the insolvency moratorium. And the minute that falls away, those businesses are hugely exposed. They've got very high levels of debt, and you've got this really uncertain trading environment, which impacts demand, their margin and profitability. And I think you're going to find many of them become unviable. And as those protections ease away, landlords and creditors who are taking a very pre-COVID approach to the whole thing.
Well, as you say, nicely leading in. So thank you for that, Kate. So the end of the moratorium, Adam, what's your view of how things are going to roll out?
Yeah, morning everyone. So as we all know, I think one of the biggest issues that faced our sector during the pandemic was the non-payment of rent, as Leo described it at the beginning. It was a vexed issue which was particularly acute in our sector, not least because obviously hospitality and leisure venues were forced to be closed during 3 national lockdowns. And not only that, the operators had to contend with various restrictions on operation and trade in between these lockdowns. I mean, sensibly, the government stepped in at the outset with various legislation which is intended to ease the impact of the issue of rent on tenants. And as you mentioned, Kate, we had the moratorium forfeiture for non-payment of rent specifically, restrictions on the use of statutory demands and winding up petitions, restrictions on the use of CRA. But I spent a lot of time during the pandemic on this work, and in our experience, almost all of our clients, whether landlords and tenants, principally the bigger corporates, they agreed their deals on pandemic rent arrears, whether in the form of rent deferrals or rent holidays, surrenders or lease re-gears. But Kate, can you tell us to what extent you consider that the non-payment of rent accrued during the pandemic still remains a critical issue for operators in our sector?
Yes, I think it's diminishing in importance because you see more and more landlords come to the table and more tenants being willing to negotiate and reach agreement. Certainly, we saw an acceleration of that when the government announced they would intervene. Suddenly, a lot of landlords who'd said, see you at the end of the moratorium and I want payment in full on day one, started to come to the table and talk about it. So throughout the entire process, we've been tracking it on a quarterly basis about deals that were done, people who had agreements in place, and up until last summer, it was about a third of leasehold premises in hospitality had not got any deal. The lessee had asked for rent support, had asked for an agreement to defer, and the landlords either hadn't responded or had just said, let's talk at the end. And with a sort of substantial proportion of that, 15 to 20%, it fluctuated around, saying, no concession, I know you're not paying now, but the rent remains due in full and it's 100% and it's payable immediately the moratorium ends. Obviously, that's a protection of legal position. And that's why we also saw some landlords going for the statutory demands and sort of starting that process and county court judgments. Even during the periods of the moratorium, we've seen county court judgments coming through. We're down to about 18% that are still outstanding and that are waiting for the arbitration process. In many of those cases, I think it's now, well, I might as well see what comes out in the arbitration guidelines, and we still haven't seen the final version of the guidance for arbitrators that they will be applying from the 23rd of March. And whether there is a clear direction from government about the sharing of the pain, which we very much hope there will be. But it's a smaller proportion, but it's still a substantial majority that are there, potentially with this all hanging over them. And of course, as soon as the moratorium ends, all of those who made deals that they thought were sensible during the pandemic, when they thought the pandemic was coming to an end and trading would be right, will start to face payments and maybe have to start to do renegotiations then. So I think still a significant issue for many. And as I say, my fear is that you've got lots of businesses that are flying under the protection of the rent moratorium and insolvency and haven't worked out exactly what happens when that comes to an end.
Yeah, so you're right to say that the moratorium ends on the 25th of this month, and that's also the date which is we anticipate that the commercial rent coronavirus bill will receive royal assent. So that's the date that the statutory arbitration scheme will come into force. So of these 18% or so of operators are still to agree deals, do you think they're most minded to pursue arbitrations under this new scheme? Are they relaying any concerns to you with the scheme as it's proposed?
Well, we're only talking to the operators, so we're not talking to the landlords. For those, they are willing to do deals. That's their frustration. They would like to resolve this. They would like to enter negotiations. In almost all of the cases, they are facing a landlord who's saying rent is payable in full. See you in court. And that's where I think that, you know, reluctantly they may have to go to arbitration. And the key concerns that we've got around the scheme, or that they're expressing around the scheme, is what is the guidance to arbitrators around viability and ability to pay, because that's the two big tests that we know are coming through. And will it carry forward the government's intention that the ministers stated, which was sharing the pain? Now, our understanding of it is that it will be the case, that there will be a direction that if you're going to arbitration, there needs to be a compromise, and you need to look at the viability of the business that would be affected if you made them pay rent in full. And then the arbitrator will look at both sides. So my understanding of the process is it will be a quick, fast arbitration process. It will be largely paper. The lessee is the one who triggers it by saying, here is my final offer. Please take it or leave it. And only if they don't get any sensible negotiation on that final offer do you then go to arbitration. Now, presumably then an arbitrator will take on board the fact that you've got one side moving and another side not. I think the difficult cases, and it's impossible to identify how many there will be where the landlord says 80%, the lessee says 20%, and you know, how do you arbitrate between that? Or where one side moves more than the other. I think it's going to be relatively easy if you have one side that is just sticking to their guns and not giving any concessions. I think the arbitrator is going to find that much more straightforward. The other elements that people are nervous about is how much of this will be financial. I don't think this is a legal arbitration process, and I don't think this is normal mediation. This seems to be much closer to valuation and rent review than it does, and sort of that financial valuation methodology, than it does to a sort of legal arbitration between two parties that disagree about implementation of a contract. So I think the government has moved towards that.
Do you think also an ability to pay in that assessment as well? Because of course, you know, presumably operators are going to have to be transparent in their in their operational figures.
They will do. I mean, the key principle that underpins the entire scheme is the tenant's viability. That's what it's all about. But one of the main concerns arising from the scheme is that these are what they call quick and dirty arbitration. So whether an arbitrator can adequately, in the time and within the confines of the scheme, adequately assess whether a tenant tenant's business is viable is probably a concern for these tenants.
It is, and I think it's, you know, how much do they discount? You know, are you looking at you should be looking at the viability of that site and the ability to pay of that site. You know, you don't want to be bringing in all sorts of things. We've seen landlords asking for, you know, full disclosure of directors' personal bank accounts when they're determining a viability. You know, you need to look at some of these sensible protections. The other question about viability is what do you do if you're a multi-site operator? You know, you've got five outstanding rent bills out of 50. Does that, what appears viable in one case might bring down the whole company? How do you assess that in the context of a quick and dirty arbitration? Hugely challenging. So I think that's another area where UK Hospitality will be working to try and provide templates, benchmarks, financial metrics that can be used by all sides to be able to know what is normal.
One of the amendments which has been made in the House of Lords, so I've been tracking the bill as it's made its way through Parliament, is they intending to impose a 4-month review to make sure that the arbitration awards are consistent and fair. But bear in mind, you've only got 6 months to refer to arbitration from the date of commencement. If tenants want to take a chance, they can leave it for 4 months to see what sort of arbitration awards are coming out. But it doesn't leave them much time, does it?
It doesn't.
Refer.
And I think, if you were a tenant, you'd want to protect your position by going in as quickly as you could and at least starting the arbitration process. Both sides, as far as I can understand it from looking at the what's published so far, and crucially, as I say, we're missing that guidance to arbitrators that might give us some help, is that they can walk away from the scheme at any time if they do reach agreement. But to add leverage, if you are in a situation where your landlord has been intransigent, or from your side appears to be intransigent, isn't negotiating, you'll want going to try and trigger arbitration as soon as possible in order to get a reconciliation and know and understand. And crucially, as I say, the second half that people tend to forget is the insolvency protections also fall away. So you're back to that test of a going concern. You want to have that resolution as quickly as you possibly can.
And I suppose, Kate and Adam, we sort of have to acknowledge that an understanding and appreciation for the landlord's position, because of course, they have their own banking arrangements,
Yes.
their own commitments and obligations. And I would hope that the arbitration process is going to encourage an understanding of that, as well as obviously the tenant's position, because I can't see otherwise how we're going to get landlords' considerations, get them to an agreement.
Well, my understanding of the process is that the tenant, it's incumbent upon the tenant to provide the evidence to the arbitrator of their viability, their ability to pay, and to support what they think is a reasonable offer. And we're working from the assumption that the tenant is always going to be going in with an offer that's less than 100%. And in most cases, the landlord is insisting on 100%. It's then up to the landlord. It's at their discretion. They don't have to put in any evidence, but presumably those who do have very real challenges around their ability to support, their ability to fund that, would provide that evidence to the arbitrator. But they're under no obligation to do so. So it could be a sort of one-sided piece of evidence that the arbitrator is looking at, and then we'll look at the principles of the bill, or by then the act, as to which side is the more reasonable. So again, I think if you've got a tenant who's refused to negotiate throughout this process, a landlord who was given some degree of discretion and a sort of proposed 50%, say, the arbitrator will take that into account and will look at the landlord more favourably than the tenant in those circumstances. The final thing I should say, which has got quite overlooked by a lot of operators, you cannot go into the arbitration process. Even if you've got a protected rent debt, you can't go into the arbitration process if there is any debt outside of the protected period. So if you missed your payment in December because of Omicron, you need to make sure that you've brought your current rent up to date and that there's no outstanding debts on that basis. So the protected rent is 20th of March 2020 to the 19th of July 2021. You need to have no debts before or after.
Okay. Now I've had actually a question in from Steve Waldron, and he asks, how will rent arbitration affect turnover-based rent leases? What are the implications? Any thoughts on that?
In terms of the move towards turnover-based rent, I think that is a trend that will start to accelerate, and you're seeing many more landlords willing to negotiate on that basis. You're also seeing a lot of landlords linking the two, so future rent or a reset of future rent being linked to sort of a solution on the rent debt. What I think you might see coming out, as Adam touched on, is you start to see the arbitration awards. You will be able to reverse engineer what looks like a reasonable rent during that period as a percentage of turnover, because the operators will be able to do that. Our benchmarking data already provides that, so we do that currently. However your rent is set, we ask for your rent as a percentage of turnover, and then you can have a benchmark by style of operation and size of company that looks at it normally, and it's a range. 8 to 13% is what we normally come out at. And I think you'll be able to see that, which will give a baseline.
During the protected period, as you rightly say, Kate, is the 23rd of March 2020 to the 18th of July. Insofar as turnover rents are concerned, of course, there's a base rent payable anyway, which would be fall under the auspices of the arbitration scheme. I mean, if your turnover is limited, then that has effect on the amount you pay anyway, which is a percentage of your turnover. But I don't know to what extent the scheme also allows an arbitrator to determine a different percentage of turnover rent.
I don't think it will do. I think it will just, if you had a turnover rent, so probably I might have misinterpreted the question. I'd looked at the question as being what happens with turnover rents going forward as a result of the arbitration scheme. I guess the arbitration scheme will apply in the same way. If you had an agreement of a flat rate rent and a percentage of turnover over and above that, and you've taken advantage and not paid anything, the arbitrator will take into account, presumably, what your turnover was during that period, if somebody is asking for something that is unrealistic. And the normal arbitration principles will apply.
Sure. Okay, well, we've got a few minutes left to go a bit freestyle now. I've got one for you, actually, Kate, in relation to VAT, because there was many years of campaigning by Jacques and others over the years on VAT and how it should be reduced on food, and then suddenly it happened during the pandemic, and there was a concession made. What's your feeling that the government are going to make that permanent, or what's the likelihood of rises in VAT coming around the corner?
Well, at the moment, the government's position is very, very firm. All COVID support will come to an end. VAT will go back up to 20% at the end of March. I think it's a very, very slim possibility that we will keep it at 12.5% and we'll get that extended. I think in the first instance, the Treasury will only entertain an extension. They will never make any lower tax permanent. They always do it on a rolling annual basis. So our ambition is to get it extended and then keep arguing for it to be extended. But it's going to be an uphill battle to get it extended from the end of March. The costs to the Treasury are high, and the Chancellor has an ideological perspective that business support has to end and you can't have sector-specific support any longer. But the key thing is, in the next 20 days, we need to keep everybody focused on changing his mind. So we need everybody on this call to go to the UKHospitality website, download the petition, download the letters, write to your MP, sign the petition. If we don't get those weight of numbers saying we need to keep it at 12.5%, he will have no reason to change his mind. We need to persuade him to change his mind.
Sure. So out of all these pressing issues, Kate, which is the one that's giving you the most anxiety above all else? There's so much to choose from, but what's the really tricky nut to crack?
Gosh, the one that I think is the biggest conundrum is people. We are a people business. They are the engine of our business. That's why we spend more than half of our overheads are people. A vending machine can give you a sandwich, but a person serves you and gives you hospitality and the experience that justifies you going out. So getting that right, I think, is the single biggest inhibitor to the successful recovery of this sector. And then the sort of, aside from that, because I'm going to be naughty and have two, is the VAT issue, because that is the way that we will navigate all of these swirling crises, because we are going from one crisis to another: energy, inflation, Ukraine, COVID, all of these global challenges. Uncertainty is the new normal. VAT gives the hospitality sector the best way of navigating through that and coming out broadly unscathed. Sure.
And to sort of finish off on something positive, because there have been some great things that have happened in the pandemic period. The one I can think of most is that, which I don't know why it comes to my head immediately, but is the payments. If you go to a restaurant, it's much more frictionless in a way, and ordering and so on and so forth. The advance in sort of technology and the way that some operators are happy to deal with ordering and payments, I think has been a real plus. So that's just an example. Could you give any examples that spring to your mind?
Gosh, I could give lots. I mean, the COVID pandemic has been the absolute worst of times for hospitality, but it has brought to the fore all the best of our qualities: dynamism, entrepreneurship, innovation, agility of leadership. The resilience that the operators have shown is because the things that make you good in a crisis are what is happening on a daily basis in hospitality. And we should celebrate and champion those skills, those soft skills that our leaders show on a daily basis. So the innovation, the speed of innovation and rollout in IT, fantastic. And also the second side of it is the heart of the community. When you close down hospitality, the lights in our town centres literally went out. The heart of our hospitality, of our communities, could have stopped beating, but we stepped up to the plate. We housed the homeless, we housed our NHS staff, we fed them, we fed school children during school holidays when the government couldn't, we've housed Afghan refugees and given them jobs when the government couldn't, we gave care packages to our NHS frontline workers and emergency front workers, we turned our pubs into village shops to keep the supply chains running and feed the lonely and vulnerable people in our communities that had no social contact otherwise. So worst of times, best of qualities, and really demonstrated why hospitality deserved to be front and centre of the government's response.
Well, that's a great positive note to finish on. And I have to say thank you very much, Kate, for sparing the time to discuss these issues with us. I hope everyone listening has found that beneficial and enjoyed it. Remains to say thank you and goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.